So, hi, Adrian Finnegan here with the top stories in Al Jazeera. Unidentified gunmen are patrolling government buildings in Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea. We're also getting reports that Russian forces have disarmed Ukrainian guards at a radar base and naval training facility in the region. Al Jazeera's Robin Forestier-Walker is in the Crimean capital, Simferopol.
We're now hearing reports from Associated Press of a large convoy of Russian military vehicles heading towards the regional capital where I currently am based, from Sevastopol, which is where the Russian Black Sea Fleet has its navy base there and its ships. And at the same time, reports of Russian military attempting to disarm or disarming the Ukrainian military here at a number of facilities.
Muslim
Threatening the biggest confrontation between Russia and the West since the Cold War. Moscow approves sending more troops to Ukraine, with the strategic region of Crimea caught up in the crisis. But how will Western powers respond in the face of warnings of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Russia has been accused of ignoring international law by sending troops to Ukraine. U.S. President Barack Obama says the move is in clear violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Russia says it's to protect its citizens. Ukraine has responded by placing its army on full combat alert. Well, there have been months of protests in Ukraine while Russia and Europe compete for its loyalties. Now the focus is turning to the semi-autonomous region of Crimea. We have correspondents in Kiev and Moscow and in the Crimean capital, Simferopol.
In the words of the Ukrainian leadership, we are on the brink of disaster. This is a young administration here in Kiev following the overthrow of former President Yanukovych. They are up against one of the world's most experienced and shrewd politicians, Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader. Ukraine is fighting back as best it can without provoking a further escalation in this crisis. It is mobilizing its reservists, it is putting its full-time troops on the highest state of alert. It has stepped up security at its key installations. They do include nuclear power plants. It desperately wants a diplomatic solution. It is hoping that it can continue to engage its allies in the West to try to convince Mr. Putin to pull back. But perhaps the people in the square, the protesters in the square behind me here in Independence Square, had little idea of the crisis that would follow the overthrow of President Yanukovych.
As far as the Ukrainian government in Kiev is concerned, there is no doubt that the heavily armed forces that have been encircling Ukrainian military installations are Russian. And at the same time, here in the capital, the regional capital, Simferopol, the regional government is feeling guaranteed and protected by those same armed forces, as well as additional paramilitaries. It feels a little bit like the eye of the storm here. There's a certain calm on the streets and also a certain degree of security that many of the local pro-Russian people feel is being provided to them. Regardless of who it is, they feel very much safe now that Russia appears to be giving them protection, and their government here is making decisions on their behalf, but it's looking increasingly like a breakaway region of Ukraine.
Well, it is a waiting game now. Vladimir Putin has shown his hand. He has the mandate from the upper house of parliament to use military force if he so desires in Ukraine. The big question is, will he use that mandate, or does he feel that the threat of military force is enough for Russia to reassert its influence in Ukraine? The phone lines were absolutely humming here with high-level conversations. Vladimir Putin spoke to Barack Obama, he spoke to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he also spoke to the French President Francois Hollande. In all those conversations, he made exactly the same point, that Russia was prepared to protect its citizens, its fellow Russians in Crimea, and also protect the Black Sea Fleet if violence escalates there.
Well, plenty to talk about. Let's bring in our panel for today's discussion. In Kiev, we have Valentin Yakushik, a professor of political science at the University of Kiev's Mohila Academy and an advisor to the Ukrainian president. Joining us from the Russian capital, Moscow, is Sergei Markov, spokesman for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And in our London studios is political risk analyst Alisa Lockwood. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. Before we start our discussion today, let's take a moment to see just how we got to this particular point. Protests began in Ukraine last November after President Yanukovych refused to sign a trade deal with the European Union. Instead, he looked for closer ties with Russia. This prompted mass demonstrations. By early December, pro-EU protesters had occupied City Hall in Kiev. The conflict turned deadly in January when 2 protesters were shot. Negotiations in February saw former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko freed from jail and politicians voting to remove Yanukovych. The president fled Kiev. Then, on Friday, unidentified gunmen appeared outside Crimea's airport, raising accusations of a Russian military intervention. Well, let's now turn to our guest then. Mr. Markov in Moscow, if I can start with you. Russia's upper house of parliament has approved President Putin's request to send Russian forces in Ukraine. Simple question is, why does Russia want to intervene militarily in Ukraine?
Russia don't want to make a military intervention to Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine to have political solution, which meaning, first of all, the conditions, formation of the coalition government, which can include all parliamentary and political parties. Secondly, disarmament of all paramilitary troops, first of all, neo-Nazis band, which occupy now Kiev and making terror against opposite politicians. Then to have free and fair elections of both parliamentary and presidential, which should be conducted without, it's very important, terror from neo-Nazis band, which is now a leading force in Ukraine. And if
but if
no
Russia wants a
solution,
political solution, as you say,
band will make terror.
If
Yes.
Russia wants a political solution, Mr. Markov, as you say, why then put troops on standby?
Because those politicians who now by force illegally grab power in Kiev by restoring of democratically elected legal President Yanukovych, they don't want political solution. They want terror. These people represent only minority of Ukraine. They know very well they have no chance to win on the free and fair Ukrainian elections.
Okay.
That's why they don't want to have free and fair elections. They want to impose their power by force.
Mr. Markov, let me put this to you. You know, some in the West are accusing Russia of overreacting, that Ukraine has been a very serious foreign policy failure for President Putin, and that this is simply a way for him to get back at Ukraine. What do you respond?
It's not issue of Crimea. It's issue of protecting ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people from terror of minority, military minority which took power in Kiev right now. Okay. Maybe you know, 79%
Ukrainians are preparing themselves for war. In Kiev, where there has already been so much bloodshed, people express their allegiance to Ukraine and their defiance of Russia. It's fighting rhetoric, and for now it still is only talk. Parliament has been meeting in emergency session. Afterwards, the Prime Minister said Russia had brought them to the brink of disaster.
This is not the threat. This is actually the declaration of war to my country. And we urge President Putin to pull back his military and to stick to the international obligations and bilateral and multilateral agreements that were signed between Ukraine and Russia.
The army has opened recruiting stations across the country. There are 9 in the capital alone. At this office on the outskirts of Kiev, men were waiting outside even before the doors opened. People have been responding enthusiastically to the call to mobilise. Here there are young men, there are older men, people with military experience, people without any military experience at all, but who still want to take part. We've visited a total of 3 stations in and around Kiev, and already in the first few hours, several hundred people had enlisted.
Somehow we have to win. I can't tell you that we will win, but I'm sure we have to win.
I know that Russia is powerful, they have nuclear weapon, but on the other side we have our friends in Europe and the United States who already claimed the support. So we will fight until the end.
In another development, the head of the Ukrainian Navy was filmed swearing allegiance to the breakaway leaders of Crimea. An embarrassment for the authorities in Kiev, who only appointed the admiral a day earlier. They say they're investigating him for treason. This is the gravest confrontation between Russia and the West since the end of the Cold War. What started here as a protest movement has escalated beyond what most of the demonstrators could have imagined. And it's not over yet.
It wasn't the day Colonel Sergei Storozhenko expected. First, a small contingent of Russians came to his Ukrainian military base and wanted him to surrender. They said they're here to bring stability to Crimea, he says. What that means, he doesn't know. He refused to give up. Then more Russians arrived, truckloads of them. The colonel watches and tells someone they're here. The Ukrainians move an armored fighting vehicle to their gate, but there will be no reinforcements. No one is coming from Kiev, he tells me. I'm alone, me and my brigade. We'll do what we can, and we'll see. We'll see. Then the troops come in on foot. Some civilians tried to stop them. But soon they had the base surrounded, the 2 armies just feet from each other.
And so we have a standoff here. Ukrainian troops, Russian troops, there are Russian troops all around here. They came in earlier and told the commander to give up the base. He said he wouldn't. And now they're standing against each other.
They still want the Ukrainians to lay down their arms. No deal, says the colonel. If they enter the territory of the base, I'll have to shoot, he tells me. An offer of negotiations. And the colonel goes to visit the growing Russian encampment. All they can agree on is no one really wants to start a war. An Orthodox priest appeals for peace. The public here is divided, some coming to praise the Russian presence, others threatened by it.
People from another country are here. What should we call it? Intervention, occupation? They have no legal right to be here.
But they are, in significant numbers, and given the way they're setting up, there's no sign the Russians will be leaving soon. Jennifer Glass, Al Jazeera, Perivalny, Crimea.
This appears to be perhaps the one place Ukraine's forces in Crimea are putting up any resistance. Behind these walls in Perivalny is a Ukrainian Special Forces base. The Ukrainian flag is still up, and they have apparently refused to give in to those surrounding them. Yet, as elsewhere, the Russian or pro-Russian forces appear relaxed. It's all as if to say they're only here to stop anyone from harming Russian civilians. A priest turned up. He'd been blessing soldiers. Will this end peacefully? I asked him. No, he said, they've planned this for 20 years. Elsewhere, there's no sign of any Ukrainian forces at all. This is Balaclava Bay, the home of the Ukrainian fleet. Viktor Yanukovych, the man who still believes he's president of Ukraine, had a yacht here, but that vanished a day or two ago. And so has the Ukrainian fleet. There's something that looks like a coast guard, but it's certainly not going to fight anyone. People saw the naval forces leave as well, and in a hurry, after what appeared to be a negotiation.
At 9:25 the military came in and everybody left the base. 2 troop carriers full of soldiers. By 9:40 they had all gone.
We tried to see if there was anyone left. Please refer to our administration, said the voice, and that was that. And at Sevastopol military airport, Russian soldiers on the perimeter from down the road. They could be seen inside the compound, guarding what we believe to be an ammunition depot. So there's no question the pro-Russian forces here are trying to press home their advantage militarily by pushing Ukrainian units in places like this either to surrender or to switch sides. And on the political front, a hard deadline now of a referendum in just 4 weeks for the separation of Crimea. That's almost 2 months before planned presidential elections across the country. By that time, Russia and Crimea may have decided their own fate. And of course the Russian forces have the eyes and ears of the loyal locals. These people have manned a roadblock between Simferopol and Sevastopol since we've been here. Wherever we are, so is Russia, says the sign. We're here to protect against fascists and terrorists, said Oleg. But where are they? I asked him. You don't know where they are, he said. Nobody expected terrorists to attack the World Trade Center. The truth is there is almost no threat to these people from fascists, soldiers or anybody else. Crimea, it seems, is going down without a fight. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, in Crimea.
Well, Tim Friend is live for us in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. And Tim, obviously major developments over the weekend in Crimea. But as Ukrainians wake up to this on Monday morning there, what is the atmosphere like in the capital?
Well, I think they've now accepted that they've lost control of Crimea. The Russians are there. They are in command, and it's happened without a shot being fired. The international community is, of course, offering lots of words of support to Ukraine, to the administration here in Kiev. But what this country desperately needs is a big financial boost. It's broke, and you talk about people waking up on Monday morning for another week. Many people here realize that their country is on the verge of bankruptcy. And John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, is due here early this week. And we've just seen the British Foreign Minister, William Hague, place some flowers, a rather solemn occasion, at the barricades where many of the protesters were shot dead, and which, of course, sparked this whole crisis, the removal of Yanukovych and the subsequent move by Russia into Crimea. And so it's really going to be a week, I think, of Ukraine hoping that they can get more than just words from the international community. They want hard cash, and I think that will be forthcoming. The International Monetary Fund is also due here this week.
And you talk about the fact that there's been words of support from the Western nations, but nothing tangible at this stage. Is there a sense that the longer this goes on, that's going to change?
Yeah, I think it will. I think everyone has indicated that what we're hearing here from what's being said in the White House and by the International Monetary Fund, that they do intend to put hard cash on the table. It's in their interest to do so if they want to, if the West wants to hang on to Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence. Of course, what President Putin, one suspects, will start to do once he's established himself in Crimea, will boost help there as well, so that he keeps his supporters happy. So, you know, they're competing interests, obviously.
Tim Friend live for us there in Kiev. Thanks for that.